Good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to see you. We know you have finals coming up. You will be rewarded for this deep thinking and great investment in your future that you're making today. So thank you for being here. First thing I want to do is remind you that this event is being recorded. My name is Eliana Laferrara. I'm a faculty member here, and I have the privilege today of moderating this conversation with Sam Bowles and Dani Rodrik, whom I will introduce shortly. Let me just tell you that this is the last event of a series that's been running this year that's called Rethinking Progress. And this series has been a faculty student-run discussion group where we decided to tackle our uneasiness with the current economic paradigm and try to think about what was wrong with it, what would be ways forward. And it's actually quite nice for me to close this circle for the year because for those of you who were there in November when we had our first meeting, this was actually about the foundations of economics. David Leibson, Eric Muskin discussed some of the things that we're going to go back to today: utility, cooperation, equilibrium. But in the meanwhile, we've seen discussions on technology, inequality, democratic erosion, climate, and the planet. So maybe our thinking over the course of the year has brought us to a different place. So today, for me, it's going to be also a personal challenge to see how I have evolved in the way I ask certain questions to myself. And of course, the opportunity to learn from Dani and Sam is incredible. Before we actually get into the meat of the event, I want to start with some thank yous. And the Dean's Office has funded this initiative, so we are grateful for making this possible. Christine Juba, who's there, has been actually the mastermind who coordinated all activity, and there's more coming because the outputs of this effort are actually going to be posted on the CID website. So we also thank the CID staff who's going to make this possible. And there's one person whom I always thank, Serbi. You can stand up. And Serbi is the co-organizer with me. But this time, instead of only thanking Serbi, I would like the core of the Rethinking Progress student group to actually also stand up and clap to yourself because I think you have co-created this. Get up, get up. Okay, there's more, but they're shy. Yeah, I see. Okay. Anyway, so this is for the thank yous, and we'll discuss whether these move forward, what happens next year, not today, but let me introduce our speakers. Samuel Bowles is a research professor at the Santa Fe Institute and Emeritus Professor of Economics at UMass Amherst. Sam has done path-breaking research on economic inequality, the evolution of human cooperation, and he's one of the leading thinkers who's been challenging the idea that humans are motivated purely by self-interest. He's explored how altruism, ethical motives, and other motives affect behavior, governance. And he did something very important together with Wendy Collin, which is co-creating a new economics curriculum called CORE, which is a free open access textbook that teaches economics through the lens of present-day challenges. Sam is the author of many books, including one that is, I think, quite pertinent for today's discussion, The Moral Economy, that he published in 2016. And there he argues that these economic incentives can actually, undermine features like our intrinsic motivations and potentially reduce ethical behavior. So he's been advocating for policies that support social norms, civic responsibilities, and many interesting ideas that I hope we'll have the chance to discuss. Our own Dani Rodrik is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy here at HKS, and he co-directs the Reimagining the Economy Program, which is sort of an older brother of Rethinking Progress, in the sense that it's also trying to think of different future approaches, maybe more linked to things like industrial policy and local development. But Dani's work has been really also path-breaking in reshaping how we understand tensions between national sovereignty, democracy, globalization. And he has advocated for industrial policy, well designed, as well as challenged this one-size-fits-all approach to economic development that was at some point prevalent among certain international institutions. His most recent book is Shared Prosperity in a Fractured World, and there he advances ideas for a new economics for the middle class, the global poor, and our climate. And again, I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss this today. So when I invited Sam to join this conversation, and I must say I couldn't think of a better way to close this series. One of these days, and I said, this is a fireside chat, and he said, I'm sure I can practice and rehearse my FDR accent. And so this actually reminded me that the first series of fireside chats that were incredibly influential was launched by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s. And there's two things of these fireside chats that maybe, speak to us today. First, that he was always starting with, my friends, I want to spend a few minutes talking to. And the second is that these were so inspiring and persuasive that they had dramatic effects. Like the very first chat on March 12 of 1933 reinstated confidence in the American banking system. Literally, the day after that, people went back to the banks to deposit their money. So why am I saying this? Because, this, my friends, this, inspiring nature, I hope we can reach today and in general a similar level of, natural, friendly conversation, but also go get a call to action, so be effective in a way. So not only
reinstill confidence in economics.
Exactly. So you will practice your accent, and we'll try to mimic, the effects of FDR's fireside chats. So let's start with questions now. And the first one I want to ask to both Dani and Sam, maybe starting with Dani. And because today's discussion is about economic paradigms, new economic paradigms, and before we talk about alternatives, I want to understand what's the diagnosis here. And because Kuhn argued that paradigm shifts occur, not because there's a new theory that wins, but because the old paradigm faces a crisis that it cannot handle, I'd like to understand, what do you think is the crisis that's breaking the current paradigm? What has actually failed? And how do we know that it's the paradigm that has failed us and not the execution of this paradigm? So Dani first, and then we go to Sam.
Yeah, I think where the failure is clearest is in our prevailing economic policy paradigm. So I think I would draw a distinction between economics in the way that it's practiced by its practitioners and the discipline, and economic policy as it's practiced by practical men and women and the technocrats, including economists who advise them, but in a somewhat different role than in their role as researchers and members of the discipline. I think with regard to the failure of the policy paradigm, I think there's both an economic failure and a political failure. The economic failure, I think, exhibits itself in the widespread increase in economic polarization of societies, in inequalities and opportunities, the distribution of the gains and losses being distributed very, very unevenly, the erosion of the middle class and the rise in economic security, and the gap that opened up geographically and spatially between parts of the countries or regions in Europe that were winning and losing. And the sense in which there was a failure was that there was, in our prevailing policy paradigm, there was a lack of appreciation that this was either going to be a major thing or that it was going to be a lasting thing. And it turned out to be both deep and lasting. The political crisis, I think, was a sense of a disconnect between our political leadership or mainstream political leaders and their electoral base, to the extent that I think political leadership, by and large, turned themselves towards the world economy and pursued policies that they either thought or were in fact imposed on them on certain rules of global economic integration, to the extent that the message that was communicated to the base was that essentially, there's nothing we can do. You have to take globalization as it is. It's sort of like weather. It's like seasons, and there's nothing we can change, and we have to pursue all these things to become globally more competitive. And it didn't matter where you were on the center left or the center right. Maybe the policies were a little bit different. The center left would say, well, we need to, invest in education and infrastructure. The center right would say we need to, cut the fiscal deficit and deregulate. But always it was so that we can become better competitors on the global stage. And I think that politically left us with a heritage of a sense of loss of control. Which is why, I think so often this political message from the extremes of, giving you back control became so politically salient and became a politically powerful message. So I would say those were the two failures.
First, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here with Dani and Eliana, people whose work I've known forever, and I've known also them forever, and I admire very much. I was thinking, as Eliana was introducing me, a little fact, which is, it was 61 years ago that I taught my first graduate course to PhD students, which was in the PhD program here, I was teaching the Advanced Microeconomic Theory course, which was, of course, traditional neoclassical economics at the time. The only innovation was we were at the times mathematizing it. What I discovered about the dominant paradigm is that I agree with Dani. The paradigm fails in its capacity to have addressed the problems that he mentioned that we're facing. With Wendy Carlin, Eliana mentioned, we've written a series of textbooks for intro courses, intermediate courses, and so on. And we always begin in chapter 1 with the problems. So, for example, in the intro course, we start with the capitalist revolution, the generation of huge inequalities in the world, the coming up against planetary boundaries, and so on. And we do this because we want the student to say, okay, yes, that's what we're going to study. Now, what we've discovered is if you start the first chapter that way, you end up rewriting the rest of the book. Because the tools are you really going to go right to supply and demand if those are the problems? Maybe you can find a way to use them, but we do have better models for that now. And so the idea that if you're focusing on these problems, you wouldn't choose those theories as the main part of your paradigm. Now, if you look at the textbooks, everybody updates their textbooks. And so you'll see in many textbooks, at the end of the book, there's now a chapter on inequality. And there'll be one on incomplete information. And even things like public goods often comes at the end of the book. I think that's a very strong condemnation of the fact that the book was written at a time when these things weren't very important, and you just put them on at the end. Well, what I wanted to do is to think about what would a paradigm look if that's what we really cared about, addressing planetary boundaries, addressing economic injustice, figuring out what are the rules of the game to govern an economy which is no longer based on grain and steel, but is based on knowledge and care. We don't know how to do that. And the models which will help us do that are already available in economics. They're just not being taught, and they're not part of what Thomas Kuhn would call the paradigm, which was, remember, what's in the textbooks. That's what he said the paradigm is, the textbooks. So that's my One more little thing. It's not just that the paradigm fails. The last time we had a new paradigm in economics was, of course, the introduction of Keynes into the Marshallian paradigm, which happened because of Paul Samuelson's 1948 textbook. That was a dramatic innovation, and it succeeded very quickly. It was a brilliant, brilliant textbook. But it succeeded, I think, not only because of the Great Depression, and the idea that we had to have something like aggregate demand. But there was also a sense that there was a new theory of Keynes, basically. And at the time, there was also a tremendous sense of urgency because the capitalist democracies of the world were under threat. Recently because of fascism, also because of communism. And there were social movements in all of the capitalist countries which said we should do something very different from what we're doing. So everyone thought, oh, we'd better actually start rethinking economics. That's what Samuelson said in his book. And so I think that the question really is it time for a new paradigm? It's not just do we have the tools, it's not just do we have the problems, but do we have the sort of political situation which requires us to think differently about that? I hope we do. I'm not sure we do.
So can I follow up? Because, and we're going to talk about what this new paradigm might look like and so on. But just to understand what's wrong with the existing one, right? If we think of pure homo economicus, self-interest, whatever, I'm sure I can see how it's inadequate to tackle some of today's policy problems. But I would argue that the current mainstream paradigm includes altruism in the utility function. It includes bounded rationality. When you talk about public goods, it includes, ways to coordinate that might solve free riding problems. So what is wrong with this much more expanded set of still mainstream, models that, however, I don't think are leaving us in the same place where we were 20 or 30 years ago? Why do we need an entirely new one? Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's think about, again, what a paradigm is. The things that you mentioned are, of course, things which PhD students study. Undergraduates study them very little. Suppose you gave an exam to a good Harvard undergraduate in economics and asked them to actually deal with models of utility functions with altruism, or deal with the employment relationship as a principal-agent relationship and tell us what the Nash equilibrium of that thing is like. I suspect you wouldn't have a big success. And this place, by the way, is way in advance of most places. So that is, what is the basic benchmark that we're taught? And the benchmark that we're taught is not that we have incomplete contracts. The benchmark is not that we have altruistic, sometimes, people. The benchmark is we have selfish individuals interacting as price takers with on markets with complete contracts which clear in equilibrium. That's the benchmark. Then there are exceptions to that, and we call them imperfections, right? Well, if it's called an imperfection, you already know what the benchmark is. I'm suggesting we need a new benchmark from which there could be other imperfections. And that's because I think thinking clearly about these problems does require us to think about a different world. Price makers, incomplete contracts, markets that don't clear in equilibrium. These are the norm. They're not the exception. They're not something that goes in a later chapter. They're something that should be in chapter 2. That's what I'm thinking. And they're not. They are taught in grade. And for example, if you look at the course here, the course that I used to teach and the course that's now taught here, it's a fantastic course in microeconomics. It really is. And if you look carefully in the main textbook there, the perfectly competitive market doesn't come in until about chapter 8 or 9 or way down the road. That's what we should be doing in general. That's how we should be thinking. And so, people will say, oh, no, wait a minute, you have to learn the neoclassical model before you can learn the new stuff. Really? Why is that? Why not treat the neoclassical model as a very empirically irrelevant special case, which it is?
So it's actually not about inventing new stuff. It's not like you want a different set of axioms, or it's just how we teach it and what we present as benchmark.
Yes, and how the public thinks of what economics is. And I mean, if you hear people talking, they're economists, they're journalists and they're businessmen and so on. And what they say is not what we're doing today as economics. That's right.
Okay, so it's a marketing failure. It's not a theoretical failure.
No, it's not a marketing failure.
Marketing on behalf of economists.
Well, we deliberately continue to teach undergraduates as if the last thing that happened in economics was Alfred Marshall.
So, I mean, I largely agree with Sam, and I have to say that nobody in the profession has done more to teach us in a very deep and fundamental way the importance of these alternative ways of defining what our benchmarks should be. And again, I should also say that nobody has done more than you, along with Wendy Carlin, to really produce a fantastic textbook which should really be used everywhere. So I think, I wonder if we're getting too much lost in the term paradigm here, because I sense that your discomfort is, and in some ways also my discomfort with, thinking about the paradigmatic failure is, how can this be a paradigmatic failure when in our work as researchers, we already are using these tools? Because it's not like you're saying we should, import stuff from heterodox economics, or we should import stuff from, psychology or sociology. These are models that already exist within economics. And those are by and large what we're teaching to our graduate students. Those are by and large what we talk about in the seminar room. But, and I think I agree with you there's two failures here. One is that too often when we teach our undergraduates, we teach them sort of this benchmark model, which is all full perfect competition and completeness. It's sort of like, I remember interviewing in the job market a Minnesota graduate student in macroeconomics, and we were hiring somebody to teach introductory macro, and we asked him in the interview, how would you teach this course if it were taught for, just somebody who's never done any macro, first year public policy students? And he thought about it for a while, and he said, I would do it all in terms of the overlapping generations model. And since this was an introductory course, I wouldn't bring money in. I think that's the mistake that we commit with in many places. With we just take one base mark, but that's not really what graduate students do. It's not what researchers do. In defense of Ec 10, I would say that if David Leibson was here, he probably would say that we're actually teaching many of those things. But again, you say that Harvard probably is at the forefront on that. The other place where we fail is even those researchers and those people who are teaching those graduate seminars, when a journalist calls them up about any issue of policy, they tend to sort of retreat to that, first best benchmarks and perfectly competitive, complete market, full information models. And so, that's sort of so I don't know whether it's a paradigmatic failure or that's a failure in our sociology or in our social psychology as a profession. But I agree that that's where the failures are.
And I think it's because, in a sense, at least if we phrase in terms of Kuhn's different stages, there are stages where the current paradigm is able to absorb challenges, and maybe we can think of extensions that take into account behavioral failures as that phase where we have absorbed it. You're still optimizing, maximizing a function with one extra constraint, and instead when we say new paradigm, that's a shift that is a revolution. So I'm trying to understand whether we think that because most of the meetings you go to nowadays, you will hear something about crisis of the neoliberal paradigm. And so it seems like the time is ripe, but are we talking about a revolution in the sense of a truly a break with the previous one, or it's about presenting it differently, presenting stuff that we already have as the default?
Let me say what I think about that. First, what Dani said about people talking to the press is really, really true. During the time of the North American Free Trade Agreement, when it was passed, I was one of the critics of the NAFTA at the time. So I was paying a lot of attention to who was saying what in the press. And you had a whole bunch of people that go on supporting NAFTA using standard comparative advantage arguments, including some of the people who had innovated in showing the exceptions to the comparative advantage arguments. Probably one of the most famous economists in the world today was one of those. He's an important journalist now. I'm sure you can't guess who he might be. People were supporting NAFTA on the basis of false arguments. They could have supported it on other grounds, but they were supported. They retreated back to their textbook and they said, yeah, comparative advantage. And I was astounded because, here are people who themselves are innovators. But I like the question about revolution. When Samuelson wrote that book, what he said is, I'm not saying anything here that anybody under the age of 50 who does research hasn't been doing for a decade. So nothing new here, right? I just want to change the way economics as a whole profession says what we're doing. So, and what he was saying essentially is Keynesian economics quickly was persuasive with a whole group of economists who were doing research in macro. And what the revolution was to convert the rest of the profession that this is what we are as economists. So I think you're right. There was nothing new well, there were some new things in his textbook, but it wasn't Keynesianism. That was already widely accepted. That's what was going on in the seminars. So in a way, the revolution in the mind is already happening. I mean, there are lots of things we don't know and so on, but if you look at what's going on in micro, particularly more than macro, micro today is a fantastic body of theory. It's really innovative and it's really, really strong, I think. And so I think we're in the situation that we were in say 1945 or in the late 40s, the one which Samuelson tried to repair by saying, look, guys, we know that aggregate demand is really important. Let's get that into the basic idea of what we are. So let's be Marshall plus Keynes. My complaint is that when Samuelson integrated Keynes along with Marshall, what about Nash? What about Hayek? The people who were contemporaneous with Samuelson and Keynes, why didn't they get integrated? Why didn't we get game theory and information economics right during the 1940s? It would have been a different economics if Samuelson had done that. But as von Neumann said, Samuelson didn't understand game theory and didn't like it. I'm old enough to know some of these gossip things that went on, but I'm pretty sure that was really true.
So how, you rightly said that sometimes even the people who know exactly all the exceptions stick to a simpler version. There's two interpretations. One is this is a political choice. And another is if you really want to go to the nuances, then you're going to have to give answers that are, it depends, because if A, B, C, then the policy recommendation is this. If D, E, F, it's this. And you're going to basically almost justify anything because there's some version, some extension of the model that's going to tell you that you should have a different policy. So where is the line between simplifying because you need to give simpler messages or simplifying because you have an agenda and you're trying to defend a certain, distribution and power structure? To both of you.
Well, I mean, first, I'm a big fan of it depends. And because, sometimes I say that, the only answer in economics that's always true is it depends. And I don't think we should shy away from it depends because I think the way I think about economics is that unlike our conception of sort of a 19th century, natural sciences, which is that, we discover a bunch of things and then we hit some new phenomena that the old model doesn't explain. Then we have a better model that explains everything, including what the old model used to explain. I don't think that sort of model, idea that the economics developed in this sort of vertical kind of a way where we're ultimately, going to arrive at the right model. So the Keynesian revolution, for example, was extremely important because it told us that there were conditions, important conditions under which the classical model of aggregate demand and supply with market clearing and full employment would not hold. And then, so one way to think about what the Keynesian revolution was to, identify a set of different types of models where you have, different conditions. Now, I think it's a mistake to think that the Keynesian revolution in macroeconomics would have totally supplanted or replaced the classical world, because or situations where the problems are on the supply side of the economy. So what happened in the 1970s, of course, then we got to a world where the shocks were on the supply side, and the Keynesian model didn't really deal with that world anywhere. And then there was a kind of a crisis. Oh my God, is economics now completely, we don't know what economics tells us. Well, if we had a more of a syncretic approach to economics, which says that it depends, sometimes the problems are on the aggregate demand side, sometimes it can be on the supply side, sometimes we can apply the classical model, then maybe we would have had a better idea of, sort of that we know how to look for when to apply the right model. And I think that's really where we always fail, or mostly fail in economics, is that we have all this collection of models. I think we should cherish them, because, unlike in the natural sciences or in the social world, the social reality is always malleable. We're always changing ourselves with our actions. And we have to live as economists, thinking in very syncretic worlds. So think that sometimes some models will apply, others. And what economics does is actually tell us what are the conditions under which one model applies and what are the conditions under which another model will apply. Sometimes we have the luxury of doing causal inference where we can actually distinguish them, way after the fact. Other times we don't have that luxury, but we can still use the kind of economic principles to try to ease our way. So again, so my definition of economics is exactly what Keynes said back in 1938. He said, economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing the relevant model. Okay? So that's, to me, I wrote a whole book on this. I didn't know this quote from Keynes. If I had known that he had written the book, I would not have written the book, because that's exactly what the whole book is about. So but as
Great
usual,
minds think alike.
No, but as usual, Keynes says it all in so much better. But that's a very different view of how, economics, is practiced, and how we should think about advancing it. And we shouldn't shy away from it depends. We should just actually cherish it. And just know that gives us sort of, that's why, when the journalist calls you, you don't have to retreat to the benchmark model.
I really like what you said, Dani, about it depends. We here consider ourselves to be scientists, and that is, we deal in knowledge and its uncertainties. And we therefore have an obligation to convey to you something better than the normal bootstrap, confidence intervals. We really have to be modest about it. And the temptation is always, when you've got a person who may quote you in the newspaper, to say something which is a little more certain than you actually think. But the question of when you have to simplify somehow, suppose, just to irritate Dani, suppose I get a call and from some TV guy, and he says, I understand you are against industrial policy. I'm not, but just imagine I was. And I've got to say something simple. And now, one thing I could do is I could refer back to my knowledge of the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics and talk about the Pareto efficiency of a competitive equilibrium. That would be some tools that I'd have to draw upon. Or I could refer instead to Hayek and talk about the information deficiencies or lack of information that states have when they intervene to make policy. Now, if I was using the dominant paradigm, I'd go to Arrow and Debreu. And that's naturally what people did when they defended NAFTA. They could have gone to Hayek, and they could have said, actually, interventions, it could in principle be good, but they'll be mistaken because governments lack the information. Now, by the way, I don't think either of those things are true, but if somebody forced me to argue against a government intervention, it wouldn't be Arrow and Debreu that I would use, it would be Hayek. That's just saying I'm operating in a different paradigm. which is which takes information problems as being essential, and it's not something that you sort of deal with later in the book. It's something you deal with in the front of the book.
So, Sam, I'm curious because I know that in the past, some of your ideas or your, approaches have stemmed from interactions that were about policy. And, you have people like Martin Luther King, Mandela in your kind of history of collaborations. Tell us something about how, what's that? Okay.
Now, people say, are you ex-military? No. Does anybody know what this number is? It's the cell number of Nelson Mandela on Robben Island. Now, I learned more trying to answer Nelson Mandela's questions. He charged a group of people, trade unionists and business leaders in South Africa, with devising policies to eradicate the footprints of apartheid in South African labor markets. This was immediately after he was first elected. No one has ever asked me a question that hard in a seminar or along the way. That was really, really tough. And I wear this hat to honor the late President Mandela, Madiba, as we used to call him. What I found is trying to answer, well, let me tell you something else. This was a real shocker for me. I'll probably get emotional describing it even now, though it happened in 1968. I knew Dr. Martin Luther King because we had worked together in anti-war activity. And so when he shifted to doing the Poor People's March just before he was murdered, he wanted to learn about some economics. So the SCLC, his organization, he said, well, will you answer some questions? And I said, sure. I mean, imagine here I was a new PhD in economics, and Dr. King is going to ask me some questions about economics. I mean, I was in heaven. And so they sent this thing, an envelope came, and I opened it up. And, literally, my heart was beating. And I looked at these questions, and they were very good questions, economic questions. And I not only couldn't answer them, I didn't even know where to start. I didn't know where to look. Now, just imagine me, put yourself in my shoes, a new PhD, not a failure, I just got a job at Harvard. And Dr. King is asking questions and I don't even know where to start. I said that evening, I'm leaving economics, and I'm glad I didn't. But I decided something had to change. Now, I wondered what it was. I mean, I was teaching the stuff which I had learned. And so, I was part of this thing too. And so I began to think about, what's left out? And now there are a whole bunch of stuff that's left out. And I guess we're going to say more about what maybe should come in. But I have a passion about changing economics because in my own personal life, it was a terrible embarrassment to me, a real failure, that having used up society's resources and gotten really well trained, I had to start all over again at the age of 28. And so that's where this comes from. And fortunately, at the time I was feeling this, a whole lot of other people were feeling it too. By the way, from right across the political spectrum. A lot of the ideas that I thought I had, I discovered Gary Becker had them before me. And so, this is not a question of where you are in the ideological spectrum. It's just that fortunately in economics in the 70s and 80s and so on, there was a lot of ferment. And it's led to where we are now in micro, which I think is a wonderful place to be.
So let's actually, because I do want to leave room for a Q&A, let's actually try to give some key building blocks of what this new paradigm nowadays would look like from both of you. And maybe Sam, you can focus more on the foundational aspects. You have some very interesting ideas about preferences and, do we use them to describe, do we use them to assess normatively, and whose preferences should matter. And Dani, maybe then instead on the policy front, how the new policy paradigm would look like. And yes.
And you go first.
Okay. Well, as I said, where I do think we need a major change in outlook is in our economic policy orientation. I think we're in a moment of transition right now where we're clearly sort of are moving away from, what has been called, sort of the neoliberal paradigm. And I have to say that sort of, I resisted that term neoliberal for a very long time, but I mean, now it sort of seems to denote a set of policies that everybody understands. I think what I've always felt really bad that when non-economists, and it was mainly non-economists who were using that term neoliberal, when they were using it, they also typically meant neoclassical economics. And I was, for reasons that we already discussed, I was just, refusing, sort of resisting that. And that's why I wasn't using the term. That for me, neoliberalism was a misuse of neoclassical economics. That is the application of the wrong models, that we're picking the wrong sort of, models to think about these when we had the right models. Just to go back to one of the things that we discussed, globalization's consequences, the unequalizing effects of globalization, that's the standard benchmark model of trade, which says that basically in any model where you have more than one factor of production, opening up to trade is going to have very stark distributional implications. That's at the very core of trade theory. And that's like, lesson number 2. So it's not that even in this case, you have to wait until the end. It's just at the core. But yet, when the journalist, calls you up, you don't want to give ammunition to the barbarians. That's, by the way, also the term used by the same person you were referring to. Yeah. And so you always want to say that, trade is good, free trade is good, no matter, sort of. But so, where I think, so I think the issues right now are basically 2 axes of structural transformation. One is the green transition. The other is what I call good jobs, but really sort of figuring out, how to make the jobs of the future, which are going to be largely in services, essentially be, pay well, be decent jobs, have it be a path to middle class and so forth. So when I think about, industrial policies and it's a misnomer, no, because industrial policies are associated with manufacturing. It's associated with sort of trying to get in competitiveness, but I'm really thinking about, sort of broadly speaking, government collaborating with private sector actors in order to figure out how to, crowd in innovation and investment in both in good jobs and services and in towards new technologies, renewables and so forth. And the good thing is that we actually have good examples of how these things can happen, and we can build on them. And that's sort of the kinds of things that I've been working on.
Well, for elements of the new paradigm, and I think what Eliana and Dani have said, these things are not something that we're inventing today. These are things that over the last 30, 40 years have become part of what graduate students routinely learn, but which is not thought to be or spoken to be what economics is about in the public realm. The first thing is the thing that Eliana mentioned. Human beings can be selfish, incredibly altruistic, ethical, and so on. We have those capacities. I mean, this is not news. It's been well established, again and again. Why we would ever assume anything different from that seems to me to be really a puzzle. And secondly, an important part of our preferences, selfish and other regarding, is that they're endogenous. They're affected by the way we live. And again, on that now, there didn't used to be a lot of evidence of that, but there is now a lot of evidence. So we have to think about creating circumstances in which people may turn out this way or that way. Or for example, public policies which will encourage this kind of preferences or those kind of preferences. The second is that contracts are typically incomplete. This may sound like a technical point, but what it means is that when you exchange something for something else, there's often something you care about that you cannot enforce in the contract. The classic example here is hiring labor. The fact that you don't deliver labor to your employer, but you do is you deliver yourself to your employer's site, and then the employer has to get you to work. What that means is, in order to complete that contract, as Durkheim and Marx and many other people knew, what completes that contract is social norms. That's Durkheim. The fear of being fired. That's Marx. So already you're getting into the picture right at the center of economics, not the periphery, family, religion, whatever's out there. We don't really have to care about that stuff. But right at the center, you're getting social norms, the exercise of power by private bodies. That means that economics has to, if it wants to understand wage setting, for example, integrate some aspects from political science, sociology, and so on. A third also sounds kind of technical. Generalized increasing returns. I don't mean just with production functions, but I mean any kind of positive feedbacks. Now, we typically, and Marshall worried a lot about the problem, why does a firm have a determinate size? For example, suppose we had long-run average cost curves that slope downwards, which we probably do. Now, that's a problem because then marginal cost is always less than average cost, and you can't have marginal cost pricing. That's a real problem. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to teach undergraduates the theory of the firm, but they really go crazy when you tell them, oh, no, the cost curve turns up. They say, really? Does it turn up? Do you know any evidence for that? Now, if we have flat long-run average cost curves, or even worse, downward sloping ones, it's not just that the firm is of indeterminate size, given our models. It means it's hard to see how you would sustain competition under those circumstances without a fair amount of regulation. But much more than that, if in general you have positive feedbacks like this, you will have multiple equilibria. That is, think about learning language. Obviously, people want to learn the language which is common. Well, then there could be many, many equilibria of the languages which we speak. A world in which we have multiple equilibria also has a lot of unstable equilibria. And what that means, tipping points, right? If you're in a world like that, you have to rethink the way that we use calculus in analyzing our models, because what we have is situations where you can move from a situation in which you're optimizing over some smooth surface in which the calculus does just fine. But if you move far enough over an edge, you get a phase transition, as we'd say in physics. You get a phase transition and a radically new dynamic after that. That's very important for such things as polarization politics, but particularly for a green future for the planet. And finally, I think economics has defined a playpen for ourselves, which is pretty comfortable, which is we deal with allocational efficiency. Distribution is something else that ought to be dealt with. I'm not accusing economists of not caring about it, but it's someone else's problem. And we have two theorems which help us do that. The second fundamental welfare theorem, which says any distribution of utilities can be supported by some initial distribution of assets, which means if you just let the market do its work, you can do the distribution part by redistributing assets. That's the fundamental theorem, second fundamental theorem. And the Coase theorem, which says essentially the same thing. Now, what happens if you're in a world in which some distributions of assets are more efficient than others? You see what I'm saying? There are some redistributions which can solve market failures. Like, for example, suppose you have a Pareto inefficient organization of firms because the workers in the firms have weak incentives to do what the employer wants. Well, obviously, if the worker was the residual claimant of their own work, you wouldn't have that problem, because the worker then would work up to their own. They would be the Robinson Crusoe kind of thing. They would obviously solve the problem of how hard they would work. Well, how would you get that? Well, the workers would have to have assets so they could own the firm. But if they don't have assets, they can't own the firm. So, in other words, you can think of, once you recognize that markets are incomplete and the Nash equilibria of those incomplete contracts will always be, not sometimes be, will always be Pareto inefficient and technically inefficient. There are lots of opportunities to think about interventions which would essentially alter the distribution of assets or income in an egalitarian way, which would also solve market failures. So there goes the efficiency equality trade-off, which is a staple of the basic paradigm. It's still in the textbook, by the way, as if nothing had happened in the last 30 years. So there's a lot we can change.
So I'm just, in preparation for this, I actually looked at what was being done in Ec 10. So I looked at the final exam of Ec 10. And so one multiple choice question that I saw was, and I'm going to ask you this multiple choice question now. So you're on the spot. The question was, which of these following is not a central feature of economics? Optimization, equilibrium, empiricism, equity.
Which one is not essential?
Yes.
The last.
Yes. See, you passed.
Yeah. No, wait, that's an exam question?
It is an exam question.
Oh my God. I mean, okay. QED, everybody,
Okay.
it's indoctrination. What do you mean it's not part of economics?
Okay, so this basically replaces my intended closing of the fireside chat. I think we couldn't end on a better, note. Kidding. No, I just want to go straight to Q&A because time is very short. But let's see if I'm gonna take 3 questions at a time and then move on to the next. So I'll do 1, 2, and 3. Sorry, actually, let's do these 3 and then I take you next time. Yes, let's start from there.
Thank you so much for the talk. I mean, core economics was one of the first economics textbooks I ever read. I think one of the quotes that I wanted to sort of like, not from the textbook, but one I've heard in general, is that the first heterodox economist was basically Marx, right? In some sense. My question is, how much of the current paradigm stickiness and its resistance towards a new paradigm comes just from this wholesale rejection of Marxism within economics departments that we see, right? Because even within, like, I'm an MPID student, I've been here for a year now. Like, there have been probably like 2 occasions where we have discussed Marx or like any of like Marx's fundamentals in like 10 courses over 2 semesters. So how, like, until and unless sort of we move back towards like reading some more or like just understanding more of those principles or where those come from, do you think there is possibility that we move towards these newer paradigms just by refining the current paradigms that we have more and more? So
I thought I was in youth. Coming to the initial part of the discussion, and I just want to push this a little bit more, wherein, we discussed that a lot of the things that we want the new paradigm to have are already a part of economics. We just do it much later on in our journey of economics. But then, say for instance, for me, right, like anyone who's done economics, you start off with high school with the same current paradigm. You go through an entire undergraduate degree doing the same paradigm with like the same idea of a rational actor. And then probably in your last year or in your graduate study, you do things such as like imperfect information, contract theory, etc. So when it's grilled down to us at every stage of our like foundational understanding of economics, then even if we understand the more like complex ideas later on, when like someone asks us and we have 3 seconds to think, it's probably the core that and the building blocks that we think of as a reply. So my question is the fact that like more theory exists enough, or is the idea that, we build on top of the fact that there's a rational actor and now there's a contradiction that it probably isn't the case? So like the question really is, do we need to change the idea that there are building blocks and then there's contradictions that we see and hence there are these new forms that are coming up? Or to have a new paradigm, we need to create theory which doesn't build on the current paradigm but really looks at it from a very different perspective?
So I would divide the world into people who think about things and who think about minds. So physicists and chemists are thinking about things, and then lawyers are thinking about minds. And economists, I get the impression, are people who are trying to pretend to think about things, but in fact they're thinking about minds. And the weird thing about minds is that human beings are so weird, and in the way there's a feedback loop where if you define people to be certain, they start behaving the way that kind of the theories predict. And so MBA students tend to be like more selfish in certain ways. That I think there are like studies where they've shown that being indoctrinated in certain ways of thinking changes your behavior. And I guess I'm curious about like the normative role of economics, and like, is economics the best tool to solve the biggest challenges in the world? Maybe politics or like disciplines where you directly attack the normative part of the question instead of trying to kind of window address and kind of pretend to solve like normative questions with science when really science is not the tool, it's politics.
Who wants to start with which question? And you can divide them up or just both address.
Well, I'll try to remember them. I'll start because you'll remember longer than I will. Okay. As is probably obvious to you, many of the ideas that I put forward are actually originated with Marx. Like, for example, the conflict over the amount of work that's done that cannot be resolved in a contract. That he was the first principal agent modeler that there was, and it was an essential part of his ideas. I think, yes, many people in this area have no idea of that, and probably it's just as well that they don't know this idea came from Marx. I think if Gary Becker had known that some of his ideas had actually roots in Marx, he would have been quite disturbed. And when I was at a panel like this with Joe Stiglitz, who gave a very good paper on, he has a paper called Unemployment as a Labor Discipline Mechanism. Labor discipline mechanism, that is straight out of Marx. So after the talk, I said, Joe, this is incredible. You're developing and mathematizing Marx. And he hadn't heard about that. And that's, he doesn't have to read something. He's so creative. He doesn't have to go and read old things to get good ideas. But yes, I mean, it's true that I used to teach history of thought, which may be odd for somebody who also teaches mathematical economics and micro. But I thought that's the way for me to learn economics. It worked for me, plus the engagement in the world for sort of thinking of ideas. But if you think about the progress that's been made, whether it's Becker or Stigler, right, anywhere from across the spectrum, some people get a lot of inspiration from studying the great minds, and some don't. And sometimes it's said that what we should do with our economics education is that we should really have a paradigm tournament between, for example, Marxian and Keynesian and Austrian and feminist and standard and so on. I absolutely think that's a bad idea. I think basically we should just do good economics, whatever it is, wherever it comes from. As you can tell, Hayek and Marx are two of my big heroes. And if I'd say, who else did I learn a lot from? Smith, Schumpeter, von Neumann, et cetera. If you know where they come from, only one of those is a leftist. So there's a lot of great ideas out there. Now, about building blocks, it's an interesting question. I'm going to take another personal story. Sorry. A long time ago, when I was teaching micro here, and Kenneth Arrow was also here, we were debating, he and I, because we disagreed, about the graduate curriculum. We then had 4 required micro courses, 2 semesters in the first year and 2 semesters in the second year. And the students were complaining, do we really have to have 4 micro courses? And Ken, sorry, he was a friend of mine, Ken said, well, yeah, we do, because we have all this new stuff, which there was, even then, new stuff. And I said, well, what about getting rid of the old stuff? And he said, no, you have to teach the old stuff before you do the new stuff. Now, I'm not sure that's true. I think we could teach a lot of the perfectly competitive model with a price-taking behavior and so on as a special case. It wouldn't have to take up a lot of time. And I think that is the way a lot of graduate courses are now taught. But I think that, and the reason why I say this is that, I'll go to physics for a minute. The difference between classical physics and modern physics, quantum physics, for example, is not at all similar to what I'm talking about of a modern paradigm in economic and the old paradigm. If you designed a bridge as an engineer using classical physics, it would stand up. In fact, virtually all the bridges today have been designed using classical physics. They don't use quantum physics or relativity. You don't need to. So classical physics isn't wrong. It's just not a very elegant way. It's not a complete way of representing physical reality. If the neoclassical model means such things as free markets work pretty well, that we should take preferences as being selfish and endogenous, if that's what it means, it's wrong. The bridge will fall down. If you design policies with that in your head, you get bad policies. It's called neoliberalism. I agree with you. I hate the word. No, I hate it because I think it's basically it's a way of trashing economics. It is, in fact, a distinct set of policies and so on. But I think there really is a difference. And I spent a lot of time studying Kuhn, and in recent years, looking at the physics analogs to what's going on in economics. And to my great surprise, I think Kuhn is better applied to economics than to physics. Because in economics, in physics, there was not a substitution of quantum and relativity for classical physics. In economics, I think there effectively has been a substitution of what I'll call the neoclassical paradigm. Nobody takes it seriously anymore as a scientific proposition. It's just regarded as pretty irrelevant. Maybe it's a teaching device, but it isn't something about the way the world works. So I think as far as building blocks, I don't think that, I was told that I had to learn Latin before I learned French. And for example, I'm very, very happy. I learned French right away, and I didn't do the Latin. And I think in economics, the same analogy applies. You really don't have to learn everything that would be in a 1980s textbook or the kind of textbooks that I was using when I was teaching micro here. Minds and things. Valras said that he hoped that he could derive for economics a theory which would be a relationship among things. He actually wrote that. That is, he wanted the pure theory of economics to be a theory of relationship among things. Obviously, what we find out is that failed. That failed essentially. Lots of reasons why that failed, but an essential one is that the idea that we're interacting with each other as if everybody else is parametric, the Robinson Crusoe model, it doesn't work. We interact strategically. That means we're not treating each other as things. We're treating each other as sentient people who, like us, are trying to accomplish something and so on. So once you get into the fact that game theory has to be the fundamental model in economics, not price-taking behavior with parametric behavior of others, you're already out of the world of things, and you're into the world of economics as a social science. And the role of norms, I think it's a mistake. You didn't say this, but it's that we can't substitute. We don't want to go and do norms instead of economics, obviously. We want to use economics to clarify normative issues that are important to us. And we need a theory in which the things that matter to us, like, for example, the abuse of power by private actors, or the dignity that you have by having some agency and freedom in your life, these are things which readily now come to what I call the new paradigm, because that's what's going on in the workplace, a debate about who's telling who what to do and so on. That has everything to do with dignity and freedom. So the normative issues which looked like they were somehow off the table are now back on the table. And that's a good thing too, because a lot of people who have jobs and so on are upset, not only because of what they're paid, but how they're treated. How does that ever get into our models, how they're treated? Oh, we have compensating differentials.
The way I understood the question is, if this is about minds or norms and so on, why do we need economists? What do we bring to the table that maybe psychologists or political scientists wouldn't have on their own? And maybe Dani, either if you want to weigh in on this or something.
Well, I totally agree with what Sam said, and let me connect that with the question about building blocks, because you do need the building blocks, but the order in which you put them together makes a lot of difference. And I think what Sam is saying is the mistake is to start from the perfectly competitive, complete markets, complete information benchmark, because when you do that, what happens is that becomes, in your words, so ingrained in your mind that it becomes your first point of reference. Most students who don't go beyond the first year of economics don't see the most interesting stuff, and then it breeds a habit of mind and a method of public conversation where the burden of proof is always on the ones who are arguing for that imperfection, which actually defines the real world, but is not a property of the benchmark model or the baseline model. So if instead you have the imperfection or some of the key imperfections built in, then it changes the burden of proof. Then the burden of proof becomes on those who want to argue that the market actually works pretty well. And that reversal has huge implications for then how we would carry our public conversations and so forth. So how would that, what would then be that sort of building block? And when you think about what economics or any social theory is about, it's really, first and foremost, how do you get social cooperation, right? Because the economy is an act of cooperation. And when you think about, how do we think about the questions of social cooperation, you wouldn't start from Arrow de Breu, right? I mean, that seems like a very weird entry point. You would start, I think, from game theory. You would start from cooperative and non-cooperative game theory. What are the situations under which, when people are interacting under various kind of conditions, and when will they reach a good equilibrium, when they'll reach a bad equilibrium? How can you structure a game so you can, the payoffs are different? And then, as Sam says, the perfectly competitive equilibrium emerges as a kind of a limiting case of that. Multiply the number of actors, give them all the information. So I think that's the right way to teach about economics. And if that's how it was done, starting from game theory, I think would be a huge, huge improvement. So it's still building blocks, but different building blocks to start with.
Okay. So there was a question there. Any more? 1, 2, and then I'll come to you next round. Okay, please keep your questions brief, and we'll try also to be synthetic in the answers so that most people can ask. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think you've started to answer this, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about what the replacement model looks like, because my sense is that a lot of what's so effective about the old paradigm is that it gives a really, really simple model of human behavior that people can then articulate as talking heads in interviews and whatnot. My sense is a lot of your contributions, Professor Bowles, go in different directions about altruism or information or contracts or allocation or something. And if we're talking about game theory as a better kind of central organizing principle for understanding human behavior, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that looks like. Like for Keynes, my sense is that the uncertainty of being able to know the future, and then coordination becomes the sort of central problem for him, and whether that's at the core here as well, or if it's something else.
Yeah, I guess my question is a little bit similar, but I feel like a lot of times it's like tractability and elegance of models that we're kind of held hostage to. And then that leads to us saying, for instance, Vol Ross says, let's just imagine that everybody can calculate what the price is that will set the entire market together. And I guess my question is, Truman Bewley just had this book where he did a lot of interviews of like actual business people. Like, how do you set prices? How do you buy things? Is that a path forward that might be viable? Like, why are we always in the realm of pure theory?
I was just hoping you could tell us some of the questions that Dr. King asked you, and if with your new paradigm you think you're in a better position to answer any of them.
That's a great question. Shall I answer that one first? I've been through my attic so many times looking for the piece of paper, and I assembled a good group of PhD students, and nobody seems to have it, but I do remember some. And what happened is, I was like a deer in the headlights. I mean, I immediately called my friends and said, help. And so we then began what was a week-long, 24-hour-a-day seminar trying to get answers to the questions. And it was one of the best seminars I was ever at. And but one of the questions was about the movement of jobs away from the center city to the suburbs and how that would affect African-American workers. Another one was a very interesting question. It was about reparations for the damages done by slavery and enslavement. And they wanted to know, have there been other massive transfers in U.S. history with which we could compare the magnitude of reparations? And I think we wrote something about how much the railroads were given during the 19th century or something like that. The question I was asked is, what role can equality of educational opportunity play in rectifying both class and racial disparities? So these were very good questions, but they weren't questions that I was ready to deal with. I was ready to deal with them,
but you wrote a book with Keynesianism on that.
Yes, I mean, well, it's really true. You know, if somebody asks me a hard question, and if I respect them a lot, and I can't answer the question, I go write a book about it. And so I did with Herbert Gintis about exactly the question that. And by the way, Senator Robert Kennedy also asked me almost the identical question in the same year. Well, to give you some idea of the time, I advised Senator Kennedy, who I admired very much, I advised him to continue advocating for equality of educational opportunity, but not to oversell it as a way of dealing with racism or dealing with the effect of wealth on people's opportunities and so on. And to my great surprise, Robert Kennedy had a thing called his Economics Brain Trust. I was the youngest person on it. One of the senior members in the Brain Trust turned to me and very sternly said, "Sam, everybody in this room is trying to build America up. You're tearing it down." What? That was because I said that education wasn't sufficient to solve the problem, and maybe you had to deal with race and class directly. And that was tearing America down. 1968. I mean, so, okay, well, I hope we're in a different world now. Well, why don't you answer some of the other questions?
No.
I'm just going on and on.
Please go ahead.
I really like what you said about coordination or cooperation. You know what? When I think of, I begin when I teach. I still teach micro. I begin exactly with that, and I begin with a whole bunch of different games and a bunch of things that can happen, good or bad or whatever, and then you build up to different ways in which you might solve that problem.
But isn't there a bit, because to tie up with that question, I think it's about tractability. I mean, the problem. So I love this way of teaching with starting with game theory, but there are so many different games, right? As opposed to, a nice downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply and an efficient, intersection. And I think the difference with these alternative benchmarks, and it's, you could apply it to incomplete contracts or incomplete information or imperfect competition. We have an almost infinite variety of those models, but there's one single perfectly competitive benchmark with which you can do so many different things.
Yeah.
So I think there is a bit of I think it's a practical matter that seems to be a bit of an obstacle that there is no benchmark game from which you can start.
Yeah, but I think from your standpoint, Dani thinks that what economics is, it's a rich pantry of models from which you can draw. And that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. And I think, once again, we just have to be a little more modest. We don't have a clear answer on a whole lot of stuff. And when we try to have a clear answer on stuff, we often get it wrong. So I think that's part of what we should be saying again and again. I think about the tractability, however, I think there's a serious problem, which is the world we live in is more complicated than the neoclassical model admits. Because the neoclassical model allows us to do constrained optimization on a parametric environment. And that's not the world we live in. If that's true, then we're not going to have as simple answers as you get using a neoclassical model. And the fact that it's wrong is another point. But I think we have to admit, I found, for example, I've dealt with altruism models. And altruism is very easy to deal with because I just put a weight of some kind on your utility or your bread or your wine or whatever. That's a simple problem. But what happens if we're reciprocal? That if we respond to each other reciprocally, then you have a Bayesian Nash equilibrium, which is a really complicated thing to talk about. And I find, though I've been teaching this, as I say, for a very long time, I have to actually write down what I'm going to put on the blackboard or whatever I do every time because I'll get it wrong because it's just too complicated. Now, that's the world we live in, and we should stop trying to be we've been used to overreaching. We've been used to having very strong results from using very simple models. And so I think the tractability problem is really a real problem, because what we do need theories which will help us understand things, including voters, including being able to communicate with your neighbors and so on. And I think, once again, our world is actually more uncertain, and our models are more uncertain and more complex than they used to be. And if we're good scholars, we just admit that and try to go on as best we can.
You, other questions? Okay, let's go. Yep.
I'm going to posit with no evidence that if you value-weighted all policy decisions, the majority are not made by economists. People that haven't done grad studies, let alone Ec 10, they might be advised by like someone, but at the end of the day, they're making the decision. So if a lot of policymakers are learning economics, maybe through journalists or things like that, how can we create a like more, I guess, in a way, tractable paradigm so they can make smarter decisions without them having the full background of knowledge that the economics industry has?
Yes, thanks for your talk. You talked about that the answer basically always is it depends. So a bit of provocative question, isn't then like the problem that we don't have a model for it depends that answers us the question?
Thank you. Maybe another way to ask that question as well is, how do you train students who are going into the workforce to try to make policy decisions or whatever it is to navigate that complex set of models that exists in the ecosystem of economics?
You certainly. It depends on navigating that. It's and also a little bit on the question about I think the question, the problem is exactly is how to navigate those models, and that's one of the things that, in fact, graduate training does not do. The only way the graduate training tells you as to how you should discriminate among models is, with these perfect tools of a causal identification, which, for a lot of settings that, we don't have the luxury of being able to apply them. So we need a broader set of tools to discriminate, often in real time, amongst contending models. And I think there are some of those tools. We do this informally in the MPID program. For example, we teach about sort of, the tools of diagnostics, but it's much more of a craft than it's a science. I mean, the scientific part of it is running an RCT and figuring out whether it's model A or model B that works. But, but there are other things that you can do, because each model has a certain comparative statics, has certain implications that you can informally test against the real world. But there's always that uncertainty that you can never really nail it down. But we're not even teaching our students in terms of thinking of that, because our internal, philosophy of science is that, the better model replaces the worst model, as opposed to you're in a world where there are contending models and you have to figure out which one is going to apply to your particular setting. So that's how, I would think of that. How do you communicate that in the real world when, I think that that's hard, because, when the journalist asks you, you don't want to go around through, well, is NAFTA a good thing? Well, let me tell you the 15 conditions under which it would be good, and then the 20 conditions under which it would, my only solution to that is actually having diverse set of voices in the economics discipline. So that's why I thought, for example, for the longest time, I mean, the greatest, Joe Stiglitz is valuable for a lot of different things, but it was even when he was saying things in public that I thought that maybe were not right, that his social value was positive, because he's communicating to the rest of the world that, in fact, there is not so much certainty within the economics department as as you might think if you were calling the usual suspects all the time. They're all saying that NAFTA is good. So I think it's a practical matter, having different people sort of on the basis of their own priors and reading of the evidence saying different things is one way that you actually sort of communicate to the public that, there is a lot more uncertainty, and that, that's how it is, and that's what the profession says.
I have a radical suggestion, which is that, now a little background. I think I was the first person in the United States, anywhere, I think, to teach advanced micro just using problem sets. It was just an applied math course, basically. And it was hard with doing good problem sets and so on. And I published a whole book of these problems. It was 1970 or something like that. And 2 months ago, I published another book of problem sets of the new economics. Little problems, exam problems, whatever. If you're teaching a micro course, go and get my book. It's free. But what I'm going to suggest is solving little math problems is no longer what you have to learn. Let Claude do that. You're going to have to think, just like what Dani was saying. You're going to have to evaluate models. No one's going to be hiring economics majors anymore because what economics majors know how to do can be done by Claude. And what that means is for us who love economics, we're going to have to go back to teaching people how to evaluate, think, how to disagree, how to be respectful of other viewpoints, how to learn, and so on. Now, I mean, for me, this is kind of a shock because I totally believe in problem sets, and I've invested a huge part of my life. And as you take a look at these books, but I really do think that in order for the economics major to survive, and in order for us to educate you well, we've got to emphasize a lot less your ability to solve little math problems and a lot more how to do things like what historians and archaeologists and other people do in other disciplines, which is evaluate a lot of imperfect evidence, come to conclusions, differ, see where it goes, and so on. And I mean, I came to economics because I liked the certainty of it. I mean, I didn't find it, as you can see, but I think we have to get over that. And I don't think that you're good at solving little math problems is going to get you anywhere anymore. So you might as well just learn how to think.
Okay, so I'm going to take this as a signal that we close with a quick question to both of you. And I'd like you to tell the participants why they should be hopeful. And maybe why you have hope, because a lot of the things we've said seem a little daunting. And what is it that instead should make us hopeful?
Okay, well, I guess first, if you want to get hope, and also if you want to do the thing I was talking about, learning how to think, you should engage with the real world. You care about it, and it needs you. And I've done a lot of that in my life, and as you can probably guess, most of the questions I've been faced with have come from that interaction. And a few with pretty good answers, if I say so myself, have come from the fact that occasionally I did manage to come up with a good answer. So, we talk about engaging with the literature. Of course, you have to know the literature, but engage with the world. It'll make you feel great to be doing that. And also, it's probably the best thing you can do for your mind. Now, why am I hopeful? Well, one of the things the CORE project does with Wendy Carlin is we teach all over the world. In hundreds and hundreds of universities. The beginning of every first-year class, we ask students to write on a piece of paper the 3 things they think economists should be dealing with. And then we make a word cloud. You've probably seen some of these word clouds. They're the same no matter where we go. Inequality is this big, and climate change is a little smaller. And you'll find, there's inflation, it's this big, and then there's unemployment and so on. The students are really asking us to come up with something because people are scared, and we have some capacity to help, we think. So I'm hopeful for that because we're going to be pushed. We're going to be pushed in that direction, not only by our students, but by our fellow citizens and so on. And of course, that's a source of hope because I think we can come up with something. So engaging in that with all of the failures and all of the stupid mistakes that you make is just so inspiring to do. And it's a wonderful thing to spend your life on. And, maybe we can do something.
Yeah, tough question. But I mean, I would say just a second what Sam says. I mean, I think one message, I guess, is just, that, embrace uncertainty. Don't keep looking for, the blueprint that's going to tell you what to do. That you just, I think, you have to have a kind of a syncretic frame of mind, just have a lot of different ways of thinking about the world. And then when you do that, I do think that you find hope around the world, because despite everything that's going on around the world today, there are good things happening if you look for them. I think probably the most important thing is, what has happened to the price of renewables in the last 10, 15 years. That's just an amazing thing that nobody expected or anticipated that was going to happen, that would have price of solar and wind and batteries go down by 80, 90%. That's just an amazing feat of technological change and innovation that actually, puts us in a position on the climate transition challenge that, frankly, with the state of global cooperation or lack thereof, we never thought that we would be at. That's an actually amazing piece of good news. And all other dimensions too. I mean, there's so many local experiments, things that are happening on the local level, and that you can always take hope from. And then finally, I'm just hopeful that when there are reactions to growing authoritarianism. That's the biggest political problem of our time. When people in Minnesota are just pulling together and just acting against what was happening there. When the Hungarians, boot Orban out, that makes me happy. It gives me hope.
Can I say one little thing about that? Everyone in this room is privileged to be part of an academic institution, including myself. And I've been concerned about the last thing that Dani mentioned. The decline in academic freedom in America by the research organization BDEM is now substantially greater than what occurred under McCarthyism in the 1950s in the United States. So we're going through something which is 3 or 4 times in terms of magnitude of the restrictions of our academic freedom. And when you think of local politics, academic freedom is now local politics. You need that. We need that. Harvard needs that. Everyone needs it. And it's something that I think should be, along with climate change and the other things. I never thought that this would be something which I would say. I was fired by Harvard the first month I was hired here because I refused to sign a loyalty oath. I went to court and I got my job back. But we had problems those days. We had laws on the books like that. But we'll have them again. And what we have, an institution like this institution, Harvard University, is just to be cherished and defended and take a little time, because it's something that this is your temple and you got to defend it.
Yeah. That was great. That was great.
Thank you, Sam and Dani. And I think the greatest privilege of academics is to be able to speak to young minds and young souls. And what gives me hope is that you're going to carry out the work for many, many years longer than we do, and someone else after you. So thank you for joining us. And I hope this initiative has planted some seeds, and in your future work and your future endeavors, these are going to come up at some point.